Shri Paramatmane Namaha. Narayanam Namaskritte Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayamudriyet. Srimad Bhagavad Gita Sadhak Sanjivani 4th chapter Transcendental Knowledge Verses 16 to 32. Description about the reality of actions and different forms of sacrifices. In verse 15, the Lord explained that having known the divine character of actions, the ancient seekers of liberation performed actions. Now the Lord in the next verse starts the topic of knowing the truth about action. Verse 16. Kim karma kim akarmeti kavyapyatra mohitaha tat te karma pravakshyami yajgyatva mokshasya shubhat. What is action? What is inaction? As to this, even the wise are confused. Therefore, I will explain to thee what action is, by knowing which thou shalt be liberated from its evil effect, worldly bondage. Comment. Common men hold that activities done with the body and senses are only actions, while non-performance of an activity is inaction. But the Lord declares that the activities performed with the body, speech, and mind are actions. An action is determined by the motive by which it is performed. An action such as the adoration to the goddess is of the mode of goodness, but if it is undertaken with the motive of fulfilling the mundane desires, it becomes of the mode of passion. And if it is undertaken with the motive of someone's ruin, the same action is of the mode of ignorance. In the same way, the actions which are performed without attachment, the sense of mind and the desire for fruits, are classed as inaction, and they don't bind a man to the fruit of action. It means that the truth about action can't be determined by the outward activity only. Performance or non-performance of actions is inaction if one is not tainted by them, while performance or non-performance of actions is classed as action if one is tainted by them and they bind him. An important fact: Karma Yoga is not an action, it is selfless service. In it, non-attachment predominates. Service and non-attachment both are not actions. Discrimination plays an important role in both of them. All the things as the body, senses, mind, intellect, etc. are acquired and they are transitory. They should be used only in rendering service to the world because they have been acquired from the world. Moreover, they will have to be renounced. But the self or God, who is ours, can never be renounced. Only the thing which is really not ours, but which we have assumed as ours, is renounced. In fact, this is not renunciation, this is discrimination. In the next verse, Lord Krishna inspires Arjuna to know the reality of action and inaction. Verse 17. Karmano hyapi bodhavayam cha vikarmanaha akarmanascha bodhavayam gehna karmano gatiha. The truth about actions must be known, and the truth about forbidden action also must be known. Even so, the truth about inaction must be known, for mysterious is the nature of action. Comment. Actions can be divided into three groups according to the motive by which they are performed: action, inaction, and forbidden action. An activity undertaken according to the spiritual injunctions with the desire for fruit is called action. The action which is performed being free from the desire for fruit, sense of mind, and attachment, for the welfare of others is classed as an inaction. Even a prescribed action performed with the motive of doing evil to other or giving pain to others is classed as forbidden action. In the next verse, the Lord eulogizes the person who knows the truth about actions. Verse 18. Karmanya karmaya पश्येद अकर्माणि च कर्मयः सा बुद्धिमान मनुष्येषु सा युक्ताः कृत्स्न कर्म कृत्. He who sees inaction in action and action in inaction is wise among men. He is a yogi and he has performed all his duties. Comment. Seeing inaction in action means to remain untainted during performance or non-performance of actions. It means that performance or non-performance of actions is not for the self. When a man holds that he is the doer and so he should reap the fruit of the action, he is bound by actions. Question. Why has the Lord mentioned inaction in action and action in inaction, while in both the cases, inaction or detachment is the predominating factor? Answer. When a man sees inaction in action, there remains predominance of detachment. But when he sees action in inaction, there is predominance of the performance or non-performance of action. It means that detachment has its affinity for the self, while performance or non-performance of actions has its affinity for the world, including the body. Therefore, detachment is one's own duty, while performance or non-performance of action is the duty of another. In order to differentiate the two, the Lord has mentioned seeing inaction in action and action in inaction. Now, the Lord in the next two verses describes the enlightened soul who sees inaction in action and action in inaction, that is, who knows the truth about action. Verse 19. Yasya sarve samarambhaha kama sankalpa varjitaha jnana agni dagda karmanam tamahuha panditam buddhaha. He whose undertakings are all free from self-centered projections of the mind and desire, and whose actions are burnt in the fire of wisdom, him the seer call wise. Comment. Thinking of sense objects and remembering them time and again, and thinking that some of them are good, useful, and pleasurable is the mental projection, sankalpa, and vikalpa is antonium to sankalpa. These are not good and are injurious. This type of thinking is vikalpa intellect, is the abiding place of these positive and negative projections. When negative projections give way to positive one, at that time a desire to obtain those objects crops up. That is known as kama. Sankalpa and desire are the two seeds of action. If they are no longer there, the action becomes inaction. That is to say, the actions lose their binding potentiality. In fact, the body and actions have their identity with the world, while the self is different from them. But by an error, he, the self, assumes his affinity for them. The great souls have no affinity for the so-called their bodies. As actions are performed by the entire world, so are actions performed by the so-called their bodies. Thus, when they are detached from actions, not only their present actions, but also the stock of past actions are burnt in the fire of wisdom. As far as their fate, prarabdha karma, is concerned, it creates favorable and unfavorable circumstances. But being detached from the fruit of actions, they neither feel happy nor sad. The prarabdha karmas get effaced by creating circumstances. Verse 20. त्यक्त्वा कर्म फलसङ्गं नित्या तृप्तो निराश्रयः कर्मणि अभिप्रवृत्तोऽपि नैव किंचित करोति सः. Having abundant attachment to actions and their fruit ever content, without any kind of dependence, he does nothing, though fully engaged in action. Comment. If a man thinks that he is the doer while performing action, regards the body and the senses, etc., as his, considers the action his and for him, and expects its fruit, then he becomes the cause of the fruit of action. But an enlightened soul totally renounces his affinity for the mundane materials, and so he is not in the least attached to the materials for actions, to actions, and to the fruits for actions. Thus, he does not become the cause of the fruit of actions. Even a king or an emperor has to depend on circumstances, time, objects, and persons, etc. But an enlightened soul does not depend on them, because having realized the self or God, he remains satisfied in the self whether he acquires anything or not. He who is attached to the fruit of action can't perform actions scrupulously, because a lot of his energy is wasted by thinking of the fruit. Prakriti, nature, is ever active. Therefore, so long as a man has affinity for the modes of nature, actions and objects, he gets attached to them even without performing actions. If he has no affinity, attachment for the modes of nature, he does nothing, even though he is ever engaged in action, because all his actions are performed for the welfare of the world. Now, the Lord describes the detachment of the striver who does not perform duties enjoined by the scriptures. Verse 21. निराशीर्यत चित्तात्मा त्यक्ता सर्वा परिग्रहः शारीरं केवलं कर्म कुर्वन्नप्नोति किल्बिषम्. Having no desires, with his mind and body fully subdued, giving up all sorts of possessions, even performing action necessary only for the maintenance of the body, a karma yogi incurs no sin. Comment. A man can't keep his body, senses, mind, and the self under control because of hope or desire. If a karma yogi is a recluse, he renounces all worldly possessions. But if he is a householder, he does not accumulate any worldly object to derive pleasure out of it. He, by regarding it as the world's, uses it in rendering service to the world. It is inevitable for every striver not to hanker after mundane pleasures. The actions pertaining to the body are of two kinds: the actions which are undertaken by the body and the actions which are performed for the maintenance of the body. That is, eating, drinking, bathing, washing, etc., which are necessary for the bare maintenance of the body, are performed by the man of action who has abundant attachment. In the next verse, the Lord describes the detachment of the striver who performs his duties. Verse 22. यदृच्छालाभ सन्तुष्टो द्वन्द्वातीतो विमत्सरः समः सिद्धाव असिद्धौ च कृत्वापि न निबध्यते. Content with what comes to him, without desire for fruit, free from the pairs of opposites and envy, even-minded in success and failure, ever though acting, he is not bound. Comment. A karma yogi performs actions scrupulously without expecting any fruit. As he has no desire for fruit of action, he remains even-minded in success and failure, profit and loss, honor and dishonor, and praise and blame, etc. He remains equanimous in all the favorable and unfavorable circumstances without feeling happy or sad. He has knowledge of profit and loss, and accordingly he makes wise efforts also. But in result he feels neither happy nor sad, even if the evenness of mind is lost, A striver should not lose heart because that disturbance of mind is short lived and disappears quickly. In fact, it is neither performance or non performance of actions which binds a man, but it is attachment to them which binds him. Similarly, it is detachment which liberates him from bondage. A karma yogi, like an actor, plays his part according to his caste and order of life, being detached from them. He is not at all attached to the kaleidoscopic nature, Prakriti. He remains established in the eternal self. Therefore, he automatically remains even minded and thus is not bound by actions even while performing them. If a serious thought is given, it becomes clear that equanimity is natural. Everyone knows that he remains the same in both the favorable and the unfavorable circumstances. It means that the circumstances change, but he, the self, remains the same. But we commit an error that we keep an eye on circumstances, but we don't keep an eye on the self. Consequently, we feel happy and sad. The Lord, in the first half of the ninth verse of the third chapter, by the negative inference declared, the world is bound by actions other than those performed for the sake of sacrifice. He describes the same fact by the positive inference in the next verse. Verse 23. Gata sangasya muktasya ज्ञानावस्थिता चेत सहा यज्ञाया चरताः कर्म samagram pravilyate. All the actions of a man who is devoid of attachment, who is liberated, whose mind is established in knowledge, who works for the sake of sacrifice, are dissolved. Comment. In fact, a man, the self, is inherently detached, but in spite of being detached, he gets attached to the body, senses, mind, intellect, objects, circumstances, and men, etc., by regarding them as his own and is thus bound by having a desire for pleasures. So long as he wants to satiate his desire, his attachment is enhanced. In fact, whatever is to happen will happen, and whatever is not to happen will not happen, whether he desires it or not. Therefore, he who has any desire gets entangled in vain and has to suffer pain. A karma yogi, considering the acquired things of the world, neither of his own nor for himself, utilizes them in rendering service to the world. Thus, the flow of things and actions is towards the world, and the self remains the same as it is, that is, non attached. An important fact: the agent, the instrument, and the action are the threefold basis of action. Out of the three, the real basis is the agent, because the instrument and the action depend on the agent. If we give a serious thought to the topic, we come to know that a desire to act springs up only when we have a desire to acquire something or the other. The desire to act makes us an agent or a doer. This sense of doership binds a man. When a man performs an action with the desire to acquire anything, his sense of doership is strengthened. But when a karma yogi, without having any desire to acquire anything, works for the sake of sacrifice, that is, for the welfare of others, his doership is utilized for the welfare of others, and he realizes that he is detached from actions and objects, etc. His actions are not accumulated, as in the absence of doership, all his actions are naturalized. If a striver performs actions without expecting the fruit of actions, his actions also change into inaction. Desire is a root of actions. When desire is enhanced, forbidden actions are performed, but when desire is renounced, actions are changed into inaction. Now, The Lord in the next 7 verses explains several forms of sacrifice as duties for the strivers according to their inclinations, faiths, and qualifications. Verse 24. Brahmarpanam Brahma Havir Brahmagno Brahmanahutam Brahmeva Tena Gantavayam Brahma Karma Samadhina. For him, the ladle with which offering is made is God. The fire is God. The act of offering oblation is God. By God, in the form of sacrificer, is the oblation poured into the fire of God. God shall be attained by him who is absorbed in God as the act of such sacrifice. Comment. Oblation is important in sacrifice. The oblation becomes one with fire when it is poured into fire. It has no separate existence of its own. Similarly, when all the means of God realization have no existence apart from God, they become sacrifice. The cultured people recite this verse while having meals so that this activity may be changed into sacrifice. When a striver has his meal, he beholds God in the following way. 1. The hand with which the food is put into the mouth is God. 2. The food is God. 3. He who eats the food is also God. 4. The fire that abides in the stomach and by which the food is digested is also God. 5. The action of offering the food to the fire which abides in the stomach is also God. 6. The fruit of eating the remnants, that is, remaining food of the sacrifice, is also God. A vital fact. The world, which is an evolute of nature, Prakriti, is in fact seen in the form of objects and actions. The world, in the form of objects and actions, is kaleidoscopic and ever undergoes modifications. But due to attachment, we don't perceive the changing nature of objects. We perceive them chiefly as objects. All objects and activities are going into naught. Therefore, the world is practically a naught. There is existence only of the transcendental absolute. In fact, the world does not exist, but it seems to exist in the light of the eternal absolute. The non existence of the world is explained here. The world appears in 3 states: birth, life, and death. But actually, there is no life. What seems life is nothing but the process from birth to death. A man or an object starts to die the day he is born. Though it is said that he is born, he lives and he dies. If a man has to live a life for 50 years, and he is 20 years old, it means that he has to live alive only 30 years. That is, he has died 40% and his life remains only 60%. In fact, he is dying every moment. The seen is changing into the unseen, but the world seems to exist in the light of the Absolute, who is eternal. Lord Krishna declares, all is God. Verse 25. Devam eva preyagyam yoginaha paryupaste brahma agnav appare yagyam yagyenenevo pujohavati. Some yogis perform sacrifice to God alone, while others offer the self as sacrifice by the self in the fire of the Supreme. Comment. Those who, instead of regarding the actions and objects as theirs and for them, regard them as the Lord's and for Him, perform sacrifice to God because He is the Lord even of the gods. Therefore, those persons who, without having the least attachment, sense of mind, and desire for objects and actions, hold that they are only of the Lord, perform sacrifice to Him. Verse 26. श्रोत्रादीनीन्द्रियाणि अन्ये संयमाग्निषु जुहवति शब्दादीन् विषयान् अन्या इन्द्रियाग्निषु जुहवति. Some offer hearing, and other senses as sacrifice into the fires of restraint. Others offer sound and other objects of sense in the fires of sense. Comment. Here the offer of senses into the fires of restraint has been called sacrifice. It means that some don't allow the senses, ear, eye, skin, tongue and nose to incline towards the sensual objects of sound, sight, touch, taste and smell. They constantly restrain their senses. The senses, the mind, the intellect, and the ego are said to be under complete restraint when they are totally free from attachment. Sound, sight, touch, taste, and smell are the five sensual objects. The discipline in which these objects of sense are offered in the fire of sense becomes a sacrifice. It means that even when the objects of senses come in contact with senses, the senses remain free from attraction and repulsion or attachment and aversion. In both the sacrifices mentioned in this verse, perfection or God realization is attained when there is total absence of attachment. Verse 27. Sarvanindriya karmani prana karmani chapare atma samyama yogagno juhavati jnana dipite. Some others again offer sacrifice all the functions of the senses and those of the breath, vital energy, into the fire of the yoga of self-restraint, kindled by knowledge. Comment. In this verse, the trance, that is, concentration of the mind on God or the self, has been given the form of sacrifice. It means that in the state of trance, when the yogi concentrates his mind on God, his senses, sense organs, and organs of action cease to function. They become calm. When the yogi concentrates his mind on God, the function of the breath is offered, sacrificed. That is, the breath also ceases to function. In the state of trance, the breath ceases to function in two ways. The first is breath control, in which breath is suspended. By practice, it can be suspended for hours and then for days together. By this process of restraining breath, the duration of life is lengthened in the same way as the age of a frog is lengthened. When it rains, sand also flows with water. A frog is pressed down by that sand. When the sand dries, the frog remains there and its breath ceases to function. But when it again rains next year, in the rainy season, it comes to life. In the second way, the mind is concentrated on God or the self, and when the mind is totally concentrated, the breathing automatically stops. Verse 28. Dravya yagyastapo yagya yoga yagyastatha pare swadhyaya jnana yagyascha yat yaha sanshita vrattaha. Others again offer as sacrifice their wealth or their austerities or their yoga, while others of self-restraint and rigid vows offer study of the scriptures and knowledge as sacrifice. Comment. Non-violence, truth, non-stealing, celibacy, and refrain from hoarding. These five are yama, the five great vows. These five vows have been very much eulogized in the scriptures. The aim of these vows is to enable a man to have disinclination for the world. The sacrifice of wealth includes the construction of wells, tanks, temples, and inns, as well as offering of charity in the form of food, water, clothes, medicines, and books, etc. Those who utilize their wealth and material possessions for the welfare of others without any selfish motive, by regarding them as of others only, offer their wealth as sacrifice. Tapayagya, austerity as sacrifice, consists in facing difficult and unfavorable circumstances happily. Observing fast and keeping mum, etc., are also austerities as sacrifice. But the best sacrifice consists in the performance of one's duty happily, even in the most unfavorable circumstances, without the least deviation from it. Such type of austerity proves fruitful quickly. Rubbish may be harmful for health, but it works as a manure in farming. Similarly, unfavorable circumstances work as an austerity if the striver faces them happily. A man feels happy in favorable circumstances and feels unhappy in unfavorable circumstances because of his attachment to pleasures. If he is not attached to pleasures, he can understand the merit of unfavorable circumstances. Yoga stands for equanimity, the evenness of mind in success and failure, praise and blame, honor and dishonor, and pleasure and pain is called yoga yajna. That is, yoga as sacrifice. In this sort of sacrifice, a striver has neither attachment to the favorable circumstances nor aversion to the unfavorable circumstances. The study of the scriptures such as the Gita, the Ramayana, the Bhagavata, the Vedas, and the Upanishad, etc., as well as the study of one's own self and inclinations, all constitute the holy sacrifice of knowledge. Verses 29 and 30. अपाने जुहवति प्राणं प्राणे अपानं तथा परे प्राणापानगतिरुद्ध्वा प्राणायामा प्राणाः अपरे नियताहारः प्राणान् प्राणेषु जुहवति सर्वेऽप्येते यज्ञविदो यज्ञाक्षिपिता कल्मषः. Others offer as sacrifice the outgoing breath in the incoming and the incoming in the outgoing, restraining the course of the outgoing and the incoming breath, solely absorbed in the restraint of the breath. Others who regulate their diet offer life breaths in life breaths. All these are knowers of sacrifice and by sacrifice have their sins destroyed. Comment. The heart is the abode of the outgoing breath, while the abode of the incoming breath is anus. The yogis practice inhalation through the left nostril, that air having taken the life air which abides in the heart with it, passing through the navel, merges in the incoming breath. This is called purka, inhalation. When the outgoing and the incoming breaths are restrained, it is called kumbhaka, that is retention of breath. After that, the air from inside is exhaled through the right nostril. That air having taken the outgoing and the incoming breaths is exalted. This is sacrifice of the outgoing breath in the incoming breath. It is called rechka, exhalation. Inhalation is practiced by uttering the name of the Lord 4 times. Retention of breath is practiced by uttering the same name 16 times, while exhalation is practiced by uttering the same name 8 times. Thus, yogis through the left nostril practice inhalation, retention of breath, and exhalation, and then through the right nostril practice inhalation, retention of breath, and exhalation. Repetition of this process is known as the sacrifice of the restraint of the breath. When restraint of breath is practiced in order to attain God without expecting any other reward, all sins perish. Only those strivers who regulate their diet can pour as sacrifice their life breaths into life breaths. He who eats too much or abstains too much from eating can't practice this restraint of breath. The sacrifice of life breaths into life breaths means sacrifice of the incoming breath into the incoming breath and of the outgoing breath into the outgoing breath. That is, the acts of inhalation and exhalation both are suspended. This is called stambha vritti pranayama, that is, absolute restraint of the breath. Through this restraint of the breath, passions are naturally controlled and sins are destroyed. When this sacrifice is practiced with the aim of God realization, it leads to the purification of the mind and then to God realization. In fact, all sacrifices aim at the renunciation of affinity for actions. Those who know this fact are the knowers of sacrifice. When affinity for actions is totally renounced, God is realized. Those who perform sacrifice instead for God realization, for acquiring pleasures here as well as hereafter, don't know the reality about sacrifice, because it is the desire for the perishable pleasures which leads to bondage. An important fact: during sacrifice, oblation is offered into fire. The oblation has different shapes. That oblation loses its identity and becomes one with fire. Similarly, when all the means of God realization which have been described here as sacrifice are offered to God, they lose their identity. They become one with God. If they have their separate existence, it means that they have not been offered as sacrifice. Day to day actions performed for the welfare of others without any selfish motive lead to God realization. But even the virtuous actions performed with a selfish motive, that is, with the expectation of their fruits, can't lead to God realization, because it is the desire for the perishable which binds a man. So long as he assumes his affinity for the world in the form of its materials and actions, he has attachment to acquire something and to do something. This attachment is called a desire to acquire and an urge to act. Now, the Lord in the next verse explains what is gained through the performance of sacrifices and what is lost through their non-performance. Verse 31. Yagya shishtamrita bhujo yanti brahma snatnam nayam lokostya yagyasya kuttonnyaha kuru satma. Those who eat the sacred food that remains after a sacrifice attain to the eternal absolute. This world is not for him who performs no sacrifice. How then can he have any other world? O best of the Kurus. Comment. Those who realize equanimity having performed the sacrifice, that is, having performed the duty without any selfish motive, eat the remnants of the sacrifice. Such people are released from all sins and attain to the eternal absolute. A man, the self, is eternal. It is because of his attachment to the perishable that he holds that he dies. When he, having utilized the so-called his possessions for the welfare of the world, gets detached from them, he realizes the fact that he is eternal. Now the Lord concludes the topic regarding the truth about actions. Verse 32. एवं बहुविधा यज्ञा वित्तता ब्राह्मणो मुखे कर्मा जानवेधितान् सर्वान् एवं ज्ञात्वा विमोक्ष्यसे. Thus, many forms of sacrifice are spread out in the face of Brahma, the Vedas. Know them all as born of action, and thus knowing, thou shalt be liberated. Comment. Besides the 12 forms of sacrifice which have been described from the 24th verse to the 30th verse, there are many other forms of sacrifice which have been described in detail in the Vedas. The reason is that according to their inclinations, nature and faith, the strivers follow different spiritual disciplines. In the Vedas, there is description of sacrifices which people perform in order to reap their perishable fruit. So they go to heaven and enjoy the divine pleasures of the gods there. But having enjoyed them, when fruits of their virtuous deeds are exhausted, they return to the world of mortals and thus follow the cycle of birth and death. Self-centered rituals are not enunciated here, but here is the description of the selfless sacrifice by performing which a striver attains to the eternal absolute. Sacrifice is born of the Veda, and the omnipresent God ever abides in sacrifice. We should resort to such sacrifice only for God realization. In the world, innumerable actions are performed, but a man is bound only by those for which he assumes his affinity. By having this affinity, he gets pleased or displeased, and thus he is bound by those actions. But when he renounces his affinity for the body and actions, he is liberated from the bondage of actions. Om Tat Sat. All glories to Sri Parthasarthi Lord Shri Krishna. All glories to Bhagavad Vani Srimad Bhagavad Gita. Shri Hari Arpanamastu.